Good evening and welcome. We're so excited to see all of you here for the third of our lecture series this year. I am Susan Juster. I'm the Director of Research here at the Huntington, and it is always a very special treat for me to welcome this year's Ritchie Distinguished Fellow. As a former Ritchie Distinguished Fellow myself, to welcome our current Ritchie Distinguished Fellow in Early American History into this space, the Ritchie Auditorium. It is always a special treat. So we're so happy to see all of you here. Peter Mancall, who is our speaker for tonight, is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of the Humanities and Professor of History and Anthropology at USC. As a writer, Peter has said he doesn't believe in introductions. Well, too bad. He's going to get one anyway. I've known and admired Peter for many, many years. Our careers have unfolded largely in parallel with one another. He says we competed for the same job at an early stage in our careers, though I don't remember that. Neither one of us got it, which says far more about the bad judgment of that particular institution, which shall remain unnamed. And we are part of an increasingly small cohort of early Americanists who focus on the early part of that phase. I work largely in the 17th century, but Peter has been more ambitious in pushing the chronological boundaries of our field even further back into the 16th century. He has been a pioneer in a very expansive understanding of what encompasses early American history, both chronologically and geographically. Peter has also been a longtime colleague and collaborator of the Huntington's research program. As the founding director of USC's Early Modern Studies Institute, which just celebrated its 20th anniversary, and he has been the director for that entire time. And I have to say, it gives me enormous pleasure to be able to finally recognize his contributions as a Huntington colleague, as a mentor, as a collaborator, as a scholar, as a friend, by offering him the Ritchie Fellowship this year. It is an honor that is long overdue, in my view. So Peter is one of the most prolific and widely read historians of early America. The author of 6 books and editor of 9 others, he has a visibility that most of us in the field can only aspire to. He has his own Wikipedia page, which always impresses me. I realize that lots of people do, but I don't. And I really admire people who do. He's a frequent contributor to a variety of social media platforms. And all of this adds up to a ridiculous level of productivity, considering all the heavy academic service he's done in his career. Most recently, a 10-year stint as Divisional Dean for Humanities at USC. So while directing at EMSI and being a Divisional Dean, he has managed to maintain a level of productivity that is just phenomenal. His publications range widely in format and topic, but I would say he has perfected the art of microhistory, which is taking a single event or an individual and building an entire world of meaning around that object or that person. His microhistorical subjects include the Elizabethan travel writer and Shakespeare contemporary, Richard Hakluyt, the explorer Henry Hudson's final and fatal journey up the river that would bear his name, the Puritan tormentor, Thomas Morton, who bedeviled the early settlers of Massachusetts, and this is the project he's working on here at the Huntington, his most recent work, an infamous episode of poisoning in early Virginia. Each of these books is an artful blend of narrative and analysis, and each aims to reach a broader audience than just his fellow academics. It is very hard to hit that sweet spot between accessibility and rigor, between writing for a general audience and writing for one's fellow specialists. But Peter hits it every time. And I think you'll experience that tonight in this talk. It is my honor and privilege to turn the microphone over to Peter Mancall. Please welcome him.
Thank you for coming. It is a great moment for me to be able to be here tonight as the Ritchie Fellow. I want to offer my thanks to Sue, of course, and her predecessor, Natalia Molina, who helped here with my fellow fellows and to be here with the archives. It is especially important and significant to me that I'm here today as the Roy Ritchie Distinguished Fellow. Way back in the day, when Lisa and I and Sophie and Nicholas, who's not here, were living in Lawrence, Kansas. Oh, there you are, yes, living in Lawrence, Kansas. Lisa and I went to a conference in South Carolina, and a hurricane blew in. And everyone got trapped. And we had these little kids back in Lawrence, Kansas. And so we're like, oh God, we got to get out of Charleston. What are we going to do? So we rent a car. And as I'm checking out of the hotel, I run into Carol, who's at the same economic history conference. And Carol and I spent the next 5 hours together. So when people say, how did you get to LA? I say, get stuck in a hurricane with Carol and you get 5-hour job interview and you end up there. But it was, as that was being negotiated, Carol and I started meeting with Roy to create this thing that is now the USC Huntington Early Modern Studies Institute. And without them, it never would have happened. And Roy is one of my closest friends and colleagues. And so while it's great to be a distinguished fellow here, for me it has this really deeper meaning to be the Ritchie Fellow. And to be the Ritchie Fellow in the Ritchie Auditorium and to speak from the Ritchie podium is just a reflection of the fact of how important has been in building up the research division of the Huntington. So anyway, I thank all of them, and I thank my colleagues and friends who are here tonight, and out in the audience, I believe, is my undergraduate advisor, which is completely thrilling to me that he is here. And I hope I live up to his standards. Anyway, this is going to be a somewhat dark lecture. It's a lecture on a topic, a war crime, a topic that was much in the news. I thought of this project years ago, a couple of years ago, before the term war crime was on everybody's lips. And it's probably changed the way I think about things, and it may change the way that you hear what I have to say tonight, and we will see. But tonight is the story of a war crime. It's a war crime that's been hiding, as it were, in plain sight for 400 years. And in fact, it's been hiding so much, I thought it should be revealed. So on the 400th anniversary, I wrote this piece for Smithsonian. So that's the whole plot for tonight. If you read that article, you can go now, but I have other things to say. Don't go yet. That was only 800 words or whatever. I have a few more than that to say tonight. A lot of historians have written about this incident. I mean, it's in like almost every major book of 17th century history. And they all said the same thing. Oh, violence between natives and newcomers was really dramatic. And by the way, the English poisoned 200 natives. And I must have read that a lot before I thought to myself, wait a minute. This is something that tells us something very important. And when I started the project, I don't think I quite understood what the lesson was where I think I am now with it. It is really kind of remarkable. So I have some notes. I'm going to look at them occasionally. I'll probably stay to the topic, but I've got really good pictures. Because I know there's some art historians and one particular colleague of mine who's very serious about PowerPoint, so I think this is all I hope this is all up to standard, and I guess if it's not, they'll tell me afterwards. Anyway, the basics of this talk are not a surprise in the midst of what we now refer to as the Second Anglo-Powhatan War. I'm going to give you more of the background in a second. A group of English distribute poison to at least 200 Powhatans. Sort of a remarkable act, and it becomes sort of more remarkable the deeper I sort of got into the story. So I think, as I've sort of thought about this, there are two ways I'm going to approach this tonight. The first is to tell the story, to set this incident into its larger historical context. And for that, I'm going to go back into the 16th century a bit, show some pictures that some of you may know, and then move into the 17th century. But the second kind of analysis, and the one that perhaps is more timely, is what does it mean when we talk about something being a war crime? And I use the term quite specifically here, and I'll talk about that, in a couple of minutes. But just so you know, so sadly, as we all know, because in the news all the time, the term war crime, as it's currently understood, developed after World War I and then was refined after World War II. And though I think people use it rather loosely, as a matter of law, as it's been codified, it typically refers to things like using poison gas on the battlefield, mass rapes, bombing of hospitals, civilian areas, torture, executions, especially of captives. There's more, but it gives you the gist of it. I say those things because it does not refer to killing people in combat. That level of violence is perfectly acceptable in the modern world, right? So there is this sort of distinction, which is somewhat acute, somewhat troubling to me, but something that maybe we can talk through. So let me start with telling a story, and then let me come back to this question of what a war crime is. So I'm going to take you sort of on this journey back to Virginia. And many people have sort of stereotypical images of Virginia. Many of you have probably been to Williamsburg, colonial Williamsburg, and seen this sort of 20th century invention of a 18th century past, not quite a 17th century past. And you can go there and you can see these beautifully tailored gardens and these fantastic things. And, that's one way to experience it. And then if you're of a certain generation, and I'm glad my daughter is here because this is certainly of her generation, there's another way that many people know about this period, which is in Disney's kind of idiotic version of it. I shouldn't say that. Anyway, Disney's imaginative version of it. I am a big fan of Disney, but not when it comes to this movie, maybe. But these are the stereotypes that we carry with us. And I think that they are there. And what I'm going to do tonight is, I think, maybe make people rethink some of these way we talk about these things. So to understand what happened in May of 1623, I'm going to take us back a generation earlier. I'm going to take us back to the 1580s to start with this story. I'm going to take us to the Outer Banks of Carolina in 1584 and 1585, where the English arrived believing that they owned much of eastern North America. They believed that it had been given by Queen Elizabeth I to Sir Walter Raleigh, following the notion of the doctrine of discovery. That is, Europeans could lay claim to places that didn't already have, as they put it at the time, Christian princes. We're not under the control of a Christian prince. So the English claimed this territory, and they arrive in 1584, a small number of them, and the people that go there write this very vivid account about how amazing this is. One of them compares it to the Garden of Eden. They really love it. And they go back to England, they say, this place is amazing, we should go there. And this is pretty important to the English, who were really terrible at colonization and want to catch up to other Europeans. So in 1585, another expedition goes to this area. And that expedition, the 1585 expedition, has on it two people, two Carolina Algonquians, who were named Mateo and Monchese, who had been either voluntary migrants back to England in 1584 or had been kidnapped. We don't know. The documents don't really tell us so much, so we could debate that. But these two young men go back, and while they're there, while they're in England and overwintering 84 to 1585, they meet a young mathematician named Thomas Harriot. And they seem to learn English, and he seems to learn Carolina Algonquian, the local dialect, and he can communicate with them. And in 1585, the three of them go back to the Outer Banks of Carolina, go back to this place that we typically refer to as Roanoke. And then Harriet's there for one season, basically, and he goes home again in 1585. And he starts telling people about what he saw. And then he writes a little book. And the little book appears first in 1588, and then it's included in a big compendium of travel narratives by Richard Hakluyt called The Principal Navigations, Discourses, and Voyages of the English Nation. And then in 1590, this little book makes its way to a print shop in Frankfurt, and it appears in an engraved edition. If you have ever in your life read an American history textbook, you have seen pictures from this. It's like by law that these must appear, okay? So there's a lot of ways of talking about these images. We could have endless seminars about these images. I would love to, but not tonight. Tonight I'm just going to show you a few of them. So basically, if you read the typical U.S. history textbook, it says this guy named John White, a watercolorist, possibly the governor of colonies, unclear it's the same guy, goes over and makes these images, so, right, of these native peoples, these Carolina Algonquians, right, does these. And then, according to some textbooks, then the engravers, engrave the images. Well, you don't have to be an amazing art historian to figure out that this is not exactly the same thing. There's a huge amount of information included here that is not included in the watercolors that came over. Now, probably not all the watercolors survived, and the ones that survived, in fact, were damaged in a fire later on. But nonetheless, you can tell there's a fairly big difference between these two things. So bear in mind, then, that the people doing the engravings have not seen the places that they are engraving. They're using White, they're using Harriet's text, which I'm going to come back later to this evening, to describe this place. They describe not only the peoples, but they describe some of the rituals that they engage in, and they spend a lot of time talking about the natural resources there, which are to attract the English over to North America. And what I sometimes say to my students is that this particular image, this is the town of Secotah or Secota on the left, White's version. He was in no balloon. This is an imagined picture unto itself. And then it's more elaborate in the engraving. I say to my students, I think this is the most important engraving for North America for the 16th century, because this engraving, if you read this engraving, it basically sends this message of bounty and plenty. And if you read it along with the text that sponsored it, that encouraged it, you realize, wait a minute. These native peoples who don't have Christianity, who don't have capitalism, who don't have the Queen, they can do this. Imagine what we can do, right? So you have to read this in a cultural sense. So you read this book. This is not a long book. They're like 30 pages or whatever. You turn the page, and you go through this narrative about early North Carolina, and then you get to the end, and then you turn the page, and you get this text, which pops up here. And it says some of the pictures which in the old time, some of the pictures which in the old time people did inhabit part of Great Britain. And then it says the painter of whom I have the first of the inhabitants of Virginia, that's a reference to White. Give me also these 5 figures found in an old chronicle. Okay, wait a minute. The first part of the text then are a series of images based on these watercolors, however accurately is another debate. And now, all of a sudden, we're being told there's an old chronicle with these pictures of ancient peoples in them. And here are the ancient peoples, the Picts, the peoples of northern Britain, whom the ancestors of the English had found. And as you were told, sorry, I should have said this before, as you were told in this text right at the bottom here, this is to show that the inhabitants of Great Britain have been in times past as savage as those of Virginia. As savage as those of Virginia. That is, we, the English who can read this, used to be this. Naked, tattooed head to foot. Savages. Look, I mean, the blood is still dripping from this guy's head. She's probably scarier in the 16th century than he was, right? It's sending a very specific cultural message about how people can change if exposed to the right cultural stimuli. So the English have this in mind. So this is 1590. This comes out in the English. 1590s, early 1600s. Think about colonizing North America. They're not very good at it. But in 1607, they decide, okay, let's try again. And they're going to go to this place that we call Virginia. They go there prepared for war. It's a bit ironic, since they thought their culture was so superior. Of course, the native peoples would just embrace them. But nonetheless, we know from archaeological evidence that they're ready in case things go badly. Well, things do go badly, as you were aware. And so they sail across the Atlantic Ocean. They go to what they call Virginia. Is the story. That was the backstory. This is the story. They go to this place that they call Virginia. They go to Senecomaca, the homeland of the Powhatan Indians, and they call the Werowance, the headman, they call him Powhatan, although his name is Wahunsonacock, but they call him Powhatan or Powhatan. And here he is in that's the detail, in that corner of that picture. And so they realize this is their territory. And if you go, every time I look at this picture, I sort of see new things. And if you look at this picture, I hope it's clear, there's a ton of place names in here. They know they're going to a place that is already fully occupied. And they have a whole argument at why it's still legitimate for them to go there. And so the English go, and they go up what is now what they call the James River, and they plant themselves at Jamestown, which is not too far from Wahunsanacock's hometown of Weramoko. Sorry, Werakomoko. I always say it wrong. You'll have to forgive me all night. I'm going to mispronounce it. So they live not too far from each other. Now, those of you who know 17th century New England may know that Jamestown was a terrible place to go. It was like the worst place to go because you go up the James and then you go around this little corner. And they're doing that because one of the purposes of Jamestown was to raid Spanish ships. So they want a place where they can raid ships and then go up the river and hide. If you look at a map, okay, not a bad idea. But if you look at this place, it is a terrible idea because the water level in the James in the 17th century went up and down with the seasons. And so that place, Jamestown, that was fine in like March and April and whatever. You get into June and July, the water level drops down, the temperature goes up, and all of a sudden it is just a mucky swamp that they dump all of their refuse into, their human refuse, their animal waste, everything. And as they write, this is where they get their drinking water, right? So these diseases, typhoid fever, dysentery, something called salt poisoning, just eats away at their bodies and makes them irritable, lazy. They're terrible colonists. They're just really bad at it. But there they are in Jamestown, and they said, we're going to stay. Because we've given up all these other places, we're going to stay in this place. And so I think, okay, the native peoples are obviously going to embrace us. We just have to get along with this guy. Well, this guy, who they call Powhatan, who was in Seneca, he has a different idea in mind. The English think this is their territory through the doctrine of discovery. He looks at them and he says, I have built up a confederacy of 30 separate communities, all of whom are loyal to me, pay tribute to me, and he creates this power system by having 100 wives who live in these different towns with his own children in order to maintain these tributary relationships with him. When these pathetic English, who can barely make it through a winter, but through a summer, come up the river, he says, yeah, another tributary nation to me, right? He is the one in power, not them. So immediately there is this clash, and then of course it doesn't take much imagination to figure out they're not going to get along for very long. And they don't. The English get there in 1607, the first war breaks out in 1609. It's a pretty bad war. The English are in terrible shape. Physically, they are somewhat, you could argue, superior in terms of military power. That's a debatable point. But this war starts in 1609, and then John Smith, ignore the Disney version, Captain John Smith is one of the great fabulists of the 17th century. He tells the story a couple of times, and in one version, there's this great engraving of scenes from early Virginia. Well, one of those scenes from early Virginia is a scene that actually happens right before the war, and it's famous in American lore, and I'm pretty sure it's in the Disney movie, and that is in the lower part here. This girl, who's 8 or 9 years old at the time, saves John Smith, right? This is the person who we, come back. This is the person who we typically refer to as Pocahontas. She becomes a pretty important player in this whole drama. Smith writes about how she, the daughter of this powerful man, threw her body over his when he was about to be executed. Modern scholars look at this and think, that's not what's going on. What's going on is Wahunsanacock was in the act of ritually making you a tribute to him, tributary relation to him, and this is something that you just misinterpreted. Whatever happens, the war comes nonetheless, and the war goes for a couple of years. The war, in fact, goes till 1614. The war ends when the English kidnap this girl. They kidnap her, and they think they're ransoming her back. And she is going to marry an Englishman whose name is John Rolfe, whose only claim to fame was that right around this time period, he figures out a really good West Indian tobacco seed to plant to make tobacco the crop that it would become. Tobacco, the English don't know this first, but it's becoming a thing because of Rolfe and others. So in a series of negotiations, the English return Pocahontas. She marries Rolfe, and they go off to England. The English think, works for us, right? And what does Powhatan think? Works for him. She has now married into one of these nations. She's going off, and she is presumably in some form of authority. So the war ends. She goes off to England. And while she's in England, she sits for a portrait, which is engraved by Simon Van de Pass. This image, also, if you teach American history, you have seen this image many times before. This, to me, is a hugely important and revealing moment that historians who don't pay enough attention to visual evidence sometimes miss. Because the idea that Harriet had expressed, and the engravers in the DeBry workshops had expressed in that book about the brief and true report of the Newfoundland of Virginia, they'd expressed this idea. Our civilization, English civilization, is so much better. Of course, Native peoples will embrace it. Boom. She's embraced it. She converts to Protestantism. She's baptized. She changes her name. She marries this guy. She has a son with this guy. And she meets royalty. She sits for this portrait. She is super famous in the 17th century. Right? Proof. Wait a minute. We were right. If we can only expose people to our culture, they will willingly come on board. Okay? Well, she and Rolfe and the boy are about to sail back to Virginia in 1617. She becomes sick, and she dies. In Gravesend, there's actually a Mattapony oral history which claims she was poisoned, although there's not a lot of evidence, so we don't really know. Rolfe leaves the boy behind and goes back to England. The next year, 1618, her father, Powhatan, an elderly man at that point, he dies. And this confederacy, this Powhatan confederacy, falls into the control of, the documents are a little funny on this, his brother, whose name is Itoyatin, and maybe another brother, who becomes the war chief, whose name is Opechancanough or Opechancanough. He then becomes the most important player in the story that I'm about to follow up with. I mentioned to you a couple minutes ago that the English started planting tobacco. Well, those of you who have an agricultural background, that line always worked when I was in Kansas. I know it doesn't work so well in California. If you know anything about tobacco, it exhausts the nutrients of soil really quickly. And to people, if you commit to tobacco, you need fresh fields relatively soon. And this is an age in which the English thought this is our land, the natives thought this is our land, and these farmers thought we need new lands. And so they keep, presumably, trespassing onto Powhatan lands. Certainly the way the Powhatans seem to have understood it. Because on March 22nd, 1622, Opechancanough launches a war. He attacks. He launches menace. On a single day, this alliance of native peoples, these Powhatans, kill 347 colonists. 347. It's about a quarter of the population of Virginia. By the English version of the story, they would have killed all of the English, except for one boy who, of course, in the English narrative has converted to Christianity, who rushes ahead to Jamestown and says, this thing is happening, this war is happening, we have to rise up and stop them. And the English do rise up, and so that moment passes. But then there is war, and this war is pretty bad. It's pretty horrible. As the war is unfolding in Virginia, a chronicler of this war named Edward Waterhouse publishes a tract in London, a declaration of the state of the colony affairs of Virginia with a relation of the, hang on this word, barbarous massacre. I'm going to be coming back to this term about barbarity and barbarousness in a few minutes. Right? This is an unbelievably lurid account. There's a copy of it here at the Huntington. I mean, this is tough reading. When you read about all these things that Waterhouse claims that Opechancanough and his people had done, all of the crimes that they had committed. It goes on and on. Interestingly, at one moment, He claims that Opechancanough Canoe went over to the eastern shore to get poison to poison the English, but was rebuffed by a local headman who doesn't give it to him. As you read deeper in the book, as you get past the narrative, you get to this really remarkable section where Waterhouse lists the name of every person killed in the war. It takes 9 pages to tell their names, right? So I mean, this is a very powerful document. And it's to us, this is the thing that most historians turn to, right, to understand this moment that launched what becomes the Second Anglo-Powhatan War. Well, let's say that Waterhouse was telling the truth. Maybe Opechancanough did want to poison them. There is an indigenous oral history, which doesn't speak to this incident, but does say that the Powhatans knew of 2 local plants that could be used to make poison: mandrake and hemlock. So those are in the area. It's an interesting sort of a theoretical question. He doesn't get them, so we don't exactly know. So we're not entirely sure. But then something happens that we are entirely sure about. In May of 1623, the English decide they're going to go and end this war, or think they're going to end this war. Some colonists have been taken captive, so a party of about a dozen, probably English soldiers, English/colonial, it's kind of hard to tell the difference, soldiers, go up the Pamunkey River, and they go to this place, 12 or 13 soldiers. They run into at least 200 to 250 fighters who confront them. The English, according to the testimony that we have, and I'm a historian who doesn't usually put text on the screen, so I'm going to apologize, but I am going to give you the text because I think this is particularly revealing. Don't worry, I'm not going to read it to you, but I'm going to sort of summarize. This is an English witness to what happened. He basically says that Tucker goes up. This is a long letter. Tucker goes up, and he has this sack, which is fortified wine, which you can see there, which was sent a purpose in the butt. This is a big barrel with him to poison them. In other words, it's this premeditated. He has put something in this fortified wine to go and poison people. And then by the account of the English, it's not a native account, by the account of the English, it is thought that they killed about 200. And then there's this phrase at the end. That's why I have this text up here. And they coming back, the English, after distributing the poison, come back, and it says they coming back killed some 50 more and brought home part of their heads. Okay? Now, this is not some modern thing. This is contemporary, not quite eyewitness. We don't exactly know. And by the way, this guy, Robert Bennett, who writes this, he's not sympathetic to the Powhatans. He can't wait to get them out of the way to expand his plantation, or what will become his plantation. Right? But he's basically saying, this is what happened. Now, those of you who are historians of the early modern period know that horrible violence was not unusual in the period. It was not unusual for it to be committed by English soldiers, among others. When Henry VIII soldiers unleashed this devastating campaign to try to get Boulogne back early in the 16th century. And then famously, and a lot of Americans are aware of this, during the so-called Elizabethan conquest of Ireland, some English soldiers engage in some rather dramatic acts, most dramatically, most emphatically, on this place called Rathlin Island, where, according to English witnesses, the English, after basically knocking down the fort, go around and kill 500 people, including people and families who are hiding from them. So it's not like the level of violence that takes place in Virginia is unusual, even by English descriptions in the 17th century. But, and I went searching for this, I contacted every Irish historian I can think of, all these English poison? No. This seems to be unique, at least in this kind of an instance. Okay. And so now I'm trying to sort of figure out what's going on. Because I know that the English don't think twice about unleashing violence. That first war of 1609 to 1614, they do terrible things to native peoples. In January of 1623, 4 months before the poisoning, they brag to people in England that they've been stealing the Powhatans' corn, burning down their towns, doing things which are terrible things, not sort of normal warfare, but they're doing these things. But then it's in May of 23 that they do this. Now, that's the incident. That's the first part of the story. That's the story. Now, how do we make sense of the story? So this is what I've been working on now for a while to write this little book about this. At the same time, and independent of the English colonization of Eastern North America, people across Europe, and for my purposes in England, are having discussions about the rules of war and peace. And in my mind, or for my project, the most important is the legal theorist Alberto Gentili, who is at this time, he was an Italian who was a Protestant, so he has to leave. He ends up in Oxford. He's the Regius Professor of Civil Law at Oxford. Right? He publishes his first book in 1598. He publishes again in 1612. He is a major legal authority in England at the same time that the Virginia Company and the court are trying to figure out what do we do in New England. So Gentili, and then Grotius would follow in the 1620s. We'll talk about Gentili tonight. So Gentili lays out rules for war. You can kill combatants, not a problem, but you can't kill non-combatants. You can't kill women and children who aren't fighting against you. You can't take someone prisoner and kill them, right? There's some echoes of our modern standards in this. You can destroy property if they're using it in war, go ahead, burn their ships, perfectly fair game. But don't destroy their temples or their tombs. That doesn't mean it, right? There are these sort of limits. And then he has this long chapter about poison. Long chapter about poison. And you know when you can use poison? Almost never. I'll come back to the almost in a minute. But his reasoning is very particular. I mean, I read this like 3 times before I sort of came to what I think I know what it's about now. Poisoned. I'm going to give you a couple of quotes. Listen to the words. The barbarians appointed against Alexander, did they not therefore act barbarously? Using poison was dishonorable. It lacked valor. It was a deed of infamy. It is contrary to the laws of the gods. It is contrary to the manners of our ancestors. Here he's really talking about ancient Rome. It was behavior worthy of brigands and not of princes. It was wrong because it was secret, clandestine. It was the impious crime of a slave. It was the tool of, his word, barbarians. He identifies the barbarians. Ethiopians, Africans, the Scots and Gauls of old, that's those Picts that came up earlier, the Turks at all times. It was employed by infidels. He includes Spaniards among this because they are whatever. And he sums up, he says basically using poison is characteristic of barbarians. That's who uses poison. Barbarians use poison. Who doesn't use poison? Civilized people are not supposed to use poison. Okay? So I'm wrestling with this. So the English who run English know this. It's not a secret text. This is published material. So word of what happens in Virginia, in Mancall, gets back to England. And the English authorities are unhappy. They basically say, this is not allowable behavior. The people who did it, the governor and his council basically say, well, I mean, this is one of the odder documents I've ever seen. Well, not sure we did it, kind of starts off. Then it says, if we did it, it would have been okay because, like Waterhouse told us, they were going to poison us. And then they say, look, these guys went there to end this war, and it kind of went wrong, and they didn't kill 50 people. They killed 9. Like 9 was an acceptable level of people to kill in a peace treaty, but 50 was an unacceptable level. They were looking for Opie Cano, the architect of what they call this inhuman massacre. Then it sort of goes on. This is an English document. It goes on. Well, maybe the soldiers had poison with them. Maybe. And if they did, it probably wouldn't have killed anybody. And if it killed people, it wouldn't have killed that many. And by the way, even if it did, wasn't it worth it to rescue the Christian captives? That's what they say, right? In other words, they admit that they did it while saying all along there are these extenuating circumstances about why they did it. That's what the historical record tells us. Now we have to make sense of it. Did they do it, right? How did they do it? How do they poison 200 people? Well, thanks to a great curator at the Huntington who I've been working with, we've been talking about the kinds of poisons that might have been possible. And here's what we know. We know the English were obsessed with the fear of being poisoned. We know that because a sailor on a voyage of enslavement in 1568, who goes to Cape Verde, talks about the fear that Africans were going to shoot poisoned arrows into them, and in fact do shoot poisoned arrows into them, and it's terrifying. Did they know how to make poison? Yeah, because Thomas Harriot, in the Brief and True Report of the Newfoundland of Virginia, said that these people of the Outer Banks of Carolina had this thing called couscous. Some of our company took it to be that kind of root which the Spaniards in the West Indies called cassavy, whereupon also many called by that name. It groweth in the muddy pools and moist grounds. Being dressed according to the country manner, it makes good bread, and it's used very much by the inhabitants. But the juice of this root is poison, and therefore heed must be taken before anything be made therewithal. And then he basically tells you how to make bread from it and not kill yourself at the same time. So I'm fairly certain that the plant he had in mind was cassava, which, as you may know, and I'm sure I will mispronounce this scientific term, it contains cyanogenic glycosides. Sorry, chemists out there if I butchered that. It includes something that produces cyanide. And the way you make bread out of it is first to drain it out. And even into the modern world, there are sometimes horrible accidents when people do not drain out the liquid from it in sufficient detail. So they know how to make it. So thinking, well, that's the Outer Banks of Carolina. It's not Virginia. They have it in Virginia. Well, it turns out that those people in Virginia who still are not very good at being colonists, they need food. Where did they get food? They get food from the English colony in Bermuda. And in 1622, the Bermudian colonists, hearing what's going on in in December of 1621, send a shipment over, which includes figs, pomegranates, oranges, lemons, plantains, sugarcanes, potatoes, and cassava roots, along with papayas, red peppers, and some others. In March of 1622, just a few months later, and 2 months before this poisoning incident, they sent several tons of cassava to the governor of Virginia. So they know how to make the poison. The thing to make the poison is there. An English witness says they did this on purpose before they went up the river. Okay? In other words, I went into this project thinking, I'm not sure what happened, and now it's like, yeah, I'm sure what happened. Or I think I'm sure what happened. Oh, God, that's such historical namby-pamby writing. But I think this is what happened. In this project that I'm writing, I see this as a really important moment in early American history. We have this sense of early America that the English come and, a generation of people have been reading American history textbooks, and Europeans bring diseases which devastate people, and Europeans do terrible things. These things are true. I'm not denying that. One of the things that we've sort of forgotten in this time, when we look at this time period, is that the English and other Europeans really believed that their culture was so superior, indigenous peoples would embrace it. Really believed they would coexist with these native peoples. They believe that. They write about that a lot. They often say it's the primary reason for their colonies. Not making money. No, it's this cultural conversion. 4 years after this poisoning event, in what becomes the defining visual identification of it, Matthias Marion, working in the same DeBry workshop that had produced the Brief and True Report of Newfoundland and Virginia, produces this image based on the Waterhouse text, which I had already told you about. It's not hard to see that this is a depiction of what people in England would have read as barbarous activity, barbarous violence. Now, it's very hard for the 17th century. We don't know all, I certainly don't know all the information that I want. But here's what I know. I know that that war in early Virginia came to an end in 1632. And I know that I think I know that relations between English and other Protestants in Eastern North America with indigenous peoples was not the same after that war as it was before that war. They were quicker to engage in violence. And the classic example of that happened in New England in 1637 during the Anglo-Pequot War, in which the English boast, don't just describe, boast about surrounding a village, setting it on fire, and shooting people as they come out, killing in one night 400 to 700 people. They don't use poison, they don't use poison again, but they boast about this happened. So here I am now trying to figure out what is the meaning of this act. Why poison in May of 1623? Not why they commit violence. They commit violence kind of regularly. Why poison? And why, if they do it, are they so reluctant to own it? You know, they don't. They want to run away from it because they recognize that they have violated the laws of war. And how do I know that they recognized it? Because the King of England himself, when the Virginia Company collapses in 1624, says one man, John Potts, can't be involved in Virginia governance anymore. Why not? He is the poisoner of the savages. When the King of England has identified one of his own subjects as someone who did something and poisoned others, that's unacceptable. It does send a fairly significant message that I think this happened. At the end, and I'm going to stop here, at the end of all of this, I'm concerned about sort of the behavior of it. The behavior of it is so shocking to us. And I think that what prompted it was fear, on some level on the part of the English, that caused them to commit this war crime. And I think what ultimately terrified them was that they associated poisoning with barbarians, and they feared that instead of native peoples becoming like them, they, in fact, were becoming this version of barbarians that they thought native peoples were. We take for granted European English colonization worked. This reveals that's not necessarily the case. Much was at stake in early Virginia at this time, and the future was uncertain. Thank you.
Time for questions? It's a little hard to see because it's dark.
I can see nothing. There you go. Oh. Yes, Lisa?
The English so decimated that this was a matter of efficiency, right? You said 12 go and they need 200. I mean, poison seems like a pretty efficient way of dealing with it.
Okay, so the question was, wouldn't poison be an efficient way of getting rid of your enemies when there's so few of you and so many of them? Is that the question? So I think, though, there could be an argument for efficiency. I mean, this is premeditated, right? They as far as I can tell, they squeeze out this juice from the cassava into this barrel of sack, of fortified wine, and take it up. They intend to do something that they think is wrong. They don't know, according to the document, that they're going to meet this large party of people. They are going up. All they know is that there are a dozen captives. And what I didn't mention in here, which is an interesting sort of fact, they rescue the captives, and then they distribute the poison. And they do it, the interesting sequence, but this is according to Bennett, to other witnesses. Right? So they didn't have to do it, but they planned to do it, and they did it. So, if they were going to go with efficiency, right? If they were going to go that this is a way to eradicate our enemies, it would mean a repudiation of their sense of cultural superiority. We have to eliminate these people because they're not embracing us, right? I mean, they see the conversion of Pocahontas, who becomes Rebecca Rolfe, as a very important moment. And then for people in her own family to lead this charge against them is all of a sudden they are questioning a lot of things. I think this is the moment when the English really question their colonization ideas. Thank you. Danny?
Thank you for this, Peter. This is really wonderful. And I have two questions. One is has to do with your first book, actually, about alcohol and Native Americans. Is it interesting that it deals with colonial?
Is that the question?
So that's one of the questions. Yeah.
Okay, so the part of the question was that what a professor of classics referred to as my first book was my second book, but whatever, it's in the weeds. No one ever read my first book except for Lisa, so it doesn't really matter. So it might as well have been my first book. I wrote a book called Deadlier about native alcohol use in colonial America. And actually, in that book, I make the point that native peoples in Eastern North America don't really have alcohol until the 17th century. And the evidence that we have, the sketchy evidence we have for the period before 1650, before rum really takes over as a byproduct of enslavement in the West Indies and producing sugar to make rum, is that native peoples don't like the taste of it. So, because one of the questions is, wait, wouldn't they have tasted something? And the answer is, they didn't know much about what alcohol tasted like, although they seem, according to the English, to have embraced this idea of toasting to seal a political agreement.
I'm asking you a question, though. But
All right.
alcohol then does carry this sort of like, it signifies civilization, right? And if this whole problem is about separating the line between civilization and barbarism, that if they are if they're sort of lacing this agent of civilization with barbarism.
Well, okay, what's the question here? Because I'm going to have to repeat this.
See what I'm getting at? Like, they could have laced anything. They could have put the poison into meatballs.
So the question is, if alcohol is a marker of civilization, would putting poison in it mitigate it in some sense? So I think the practical answer to that question is that it's hard to poison people. It's harder. When some horrible incident of poisoning happens in America, I'm going to be arrested because someone's going to find all my Google searches, like how do you poison whatever, right? It takes a very powerful agent and one that, this is why Kosovo seems the likely thing, because it's cyanide produces this effect. So I don't think that they are necessarily thinking that. I think they're thinking this is a way of masking the taste. Bennett, in his description, I don't give you the whole thing, basically says that here's this barrel of sack. He takes a drink of something and then they switch barrels, right? This is really thought out, according to Bennett. At least they switch it and they give him the poison. I don't know that they thought through what does it tell you culturally. I see a hand in the back, but I don't know who that is. I can't tell you. It's my Gentili friend. Yes, please. This is my fellow who said, you got to read Gentili. Dead on.
I have a genuine question, though, about Grotius. And when he writes Grotius, does Grotius amend or add anything to Gentili's writing about poisoning, or does he just kind of repeat the same sources?
So the question is, does Grotius amend or add anything from Gentili? So my reading of Grotius writes less about it than Gentili did. He doesn't seem to have the same categories of barbarism that I see in Gentili. Grotius is more, you shouldn't use poison in war because it's a tool of assassins. It's what Italians do. It's sneaky and it's bad. But it's not nearly as detailed as what Gentili did. That's a great question. Okay. I can't see who that is. Sorry. Please.
Were there any teachings among the Powhatans with respect to dishonorable death or inability to reach the spirit realm that might have played into the choice by the English of poisoning as a tool of psychological warfare?
That's a wonderful question. I don't think Okay, so there are two ways of approaching that question, right? One is through sort of indigenous oral history, which would go back to this, and there's very little that I found about talking about poison. I found this reference to these two plants which I mentioned, right? So they know that there's poison available. It seems to imply they must have used it at some point, but I don't really know. But that question is certainly way beyond the cultural abilities of the English to have read in this time period. So even if it was true that a way of dying might have had a different effect on the next life of these Powhatans, these Powhatan warriors, because the description is they're all warriors, it's all men. The English would not have been savvy enough. There's nothing in the document that suggests that they knew that. I mean, I think, that in some sense, I mean, that's a great question, right? Because part of what the English assume is that colonization is going to eradicate what they think of as these heathen beliefs. And, they mock in documents from Harriet and others, they mock in Eastern North America indigenous beliefs. They say, these are your healers, these are charlatans. That idea comes up across Eastern North America, right? They are fascinated, although you get these documents later in the 17th century than this period, they're fascinated with indigenous peoples. I don't have this for the Powhatans. But other indigenous peoples in Eastern North America, they're fascinated with the fact that they bury with bodies these really useful goods. Like, what is going on here? Why they trade for these things? So they don't get the idea of why someone would bury a body with what is necessary. So I think that question, they're just not there yet to sort of sense that. I mean, it's a great question. Well, there's only one person in the room who could address me that way. Sophie? Okay, so the question was from one of the lawyers in the room, why did the Powhatans accept wine during a war? And I think the answer is that they had no reason to be suspicious of it. The English claimed that they were trying to end the war. It was a parley, it was a peace treaty. And I think that they genuinely believed that the English were playing fairly with them. The English had never done this before. I think there was no reason to suspect them of it. That's a good question, but I think that's it. Please.
Are there any estimates of the relative population breakdown at the time between the colonials and the Indians?
In this particular area? So when the English arrive, there are historians who would estimate about 15,000 indigenous peoples around the Chesapeake. Their numbers start to decline, but less. The English numbers are very small. So I think in this period, I'm looking at my friend, a great colonial historian who's sitting right behind you. I think in this period in early Virginia, there's something like 4,000 colonists who are the survivors of about 8,000 migrants. Dan, does that sound ballpark right? Yeah, that's Dan Richter. So the other Dan Richter, oh my God, a lot of Dan Richters in the room. So the English population is still relatively small, so the Powhatans way still outnumber them. That would change over the course of the 17th century, but I've been working for years on this kind of long book about early America, and through the 17th century, Native peoples far outnumber Europeans, except for in pockets along the East Coast. Virginia would have been one of those pockets by the time you get to the 1670s, 1680s, but not before then. But what does happen is that Native peoples, that English populations spread into the interior once English embraced both tobacco cultivation and purchasing enslaved Africans. And so they push in, and Native peoples, there are fewer of them in this prime area closer to the ocean. But in terms of numbers, there's still many more Native peoples than there are English at this particular time. And just to the north, the Pilgrims, who just arrived at Patuxet, which they called New Plymouth in 1620, half of them die within the first year. And they are a really small population. There are never more than several hundred people in Plymouth before 1630. So there's not a huge demographic English presence in Eastern North America in these particular years. Okay? I don't know. How about two more? Steve and then whoever that is. I can't see who that is, so sorry. Steve?
It seems like a really kind of inconvenient truth. I mean, English justifications for their own colonization was that they were better than the Spanish. And I'm wondering if there were any Spanish translations of this war crime, and if the Spanish or any other European power made something of this to sort of prove the English perhaps were not as virtuous as they said they were going to be.
Wow, that's a great question. Okay, so the first answer, so this Professor Hackle has asked, are there any Spanish translations of this document? And then I'm going to have to free associate after that. Okay, so the answer is the Waterhouse document, when it comes out of the DeBry Workshop, is published just in German and Latin. It's not published in English. I mean, the illustrations exist in texts which are not in English language. The English language. So if there's a Spanish translation of it, I haven't found it. I'd love to find it. But you do point to something really important. When they create this image, they are used to, the Bride Workshop is used to depicting violence, and most of the violent images they depicted are Spaniards against Indigenous North Americans, because part of this sort of English/Protestant mission is we've got to stop those terrible Iberian Catholics, right? So there is this visual language of savagery, of violence, that they would apply to the Spanish. But in terms of the other way around, did the Spanish use sex? I don't know the answer. It's a great question. Maybe I'll find that. And then there was one more question over here. Please.
I'm wondering if you ever think about going off of your area and looking at the Belgians in the Congo, for instance.
The question is, would I ever think about moving out of my area and looking at the Congo? Is that the Belgians in the Congo? Sorry, Belgians. There are great historians who work on the Belgians in the Congo. I am not among them. I've taken my whole career trying to understand something very specific about this relatively narrow slice of land in eastern North America that runs maybe from Carolina to Maine and no farther west than the Appalachians. That has sufficiently clouded my mind that I don't think I'm going to be getting to other continents. If I can figure that out, I'll rest easily. But thank you.